So, we just saw why the paper issue is difficult. Because finding a topic is a tough thing to do, and I don't have topics for everyone to have. And as I tell you, what I do generally do is ask what you're interested in. And then if you're interested in a certain thing, I say, well, go and do that. So that's what we just did with this young lady here, so that worked out fine. But, you know, it's not the easiest thing to find a topic. Plus, it takes a lot of work. In her case, I mean, she should be reading this new book by Jody Magnus on the archaeology and the scrolls. I'm not sure that there's a lot of new material in it particularly, but at least acquaint you with what some of the issues that she considers to be important are. And N.T.will, of course, the first one who wrote on that, archaeology and the scrolls, and my book, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians in Qumran. I have very severe criticism of the archaeology of Qumran. So there's a lot of things to do, and that's how you have to do a research paper. You have to start reading a lot of books and trying to get something that you can write about in that area that you consider to be interesting and significant. So that's, papers are not, you know, less than an exam in work. They're actually more than an exam. But you might learn more from them. Or look at the Damascus Document. We might pick up some of these other things as we go along, but I think we should get into the documents themselves if we can. So I'm going to use my own translation. You can use Ramesh if you want. Or some other confusion. It's not in that book, I don't think. It's in the blue pamphlet, right? It's in this book here, the one he's got. And there's a pamphlet. It's page, well, in Ramesh, what page is it in Ramesh? 125. 125, and then this one is 355. And now hear all you knowers of righteousness. The thing Ramesh has, all you, here I have an older version of Ramesh here, so easier to handle. I'll just pick this up and I'll compare occasionally what he has with what I have, because it's sometimes interesting. He says, all you who know righteousness. It's not the same thing, but in fact, you see, it does literally say knowers of righteousness. That's what the Hebrew really does say. All you who know righteousness is fair enough, but hear all knowers of righteousness. So right away, even though this is not the beginning, in fact, we found now earlier we now know from, and he's got some of the other versions from K4 that he shows you there, because of the breaking of the monopoly, they now have all this available to them that they didn't have previously. This is the Cairo-Geniza version that I have here. We now know that there is some material preceding this as an introduction. Not, I don't think, terribly significant, but I think at one point it does refer to zeal in the material preceding it. Here we right away know that righteousness is an important doctrine. And that is, if you look at the Hebrew, I give you the Hebrew, though you probably don't know Hebrew, but if those of you who want to take the time, it says, V'ata shamu kol yodei zedek. Kol, it means all, yodei means knowers of, zedek is righteousness. So it actually uses the word zedek there. So, you know, always should use the same word. Where you see a Hebrew thing, the word should be totally consistent in translation, and many times in these translations it is not. Garcia Martinez in the Brill paperback is not consistent because his translation goes through Spanish into English. And I don't even know if the Spanish was terribly consistent or accurate. So it can't possibly be consistent, and it isn't. The other translation that's available on the market is my colleague Weiss with some other associates. And that's not very good either, I don't think, in terms of being precise. I had to try to keep the Dead Sea Scrolls uncovered, though I didn't do the original translations. I tried to make them consistent and precise when I went over them and critiqued them and tried to polish them up. That was my main, aside from writing the commentaries, my main activity in that book, making them consistent. And here I've tried to always the same word, this translation, translate the same word in ink. And there it is, right away, and comprehend the works of God. Let's see, what is for mesh out there?
Consider.
Consider the works of God? Yes, works, good. It doesn't matter, consider that.
I have a feeling that King James would have said, behold, had there been a King James.
Maybe. Because he has a dispute with all flesh. And it literally says, will do. And the reason I put the do in there is because I want to emphasize the word doing, because that's there. That's in the text. And the word in Hebrew for works is based on the verb in Hebrew to do. So doing is important. And if you have to do the Torah, and he will do judgment. What do you have there in Ramesh?
Condemn.
Yeah. Well, it literally says, Oseh Mishpat, do judgment. That's why I didn't put condemn, because there is a place where condemn is used, but it's not here. Do judgment may be condemned. But do judgment is more than condemn. It implies a last judgment, which is an important concept in the scrolls. There is a last judgment in the scrolls. That's why you say the translations are not important. They're very, very important. It's too bad we can't lend this young lady a book to look on so she can see. But does anyone have an extra book that she can look at? Because it's really a shame not to have things available to you. Oh, you can. Yeah, you can look at that there. What page is it?
127.
127, okay. That's for Mesh. I think he is, regardless of my criticism, I think he is the most precise of all the translators when it comes down to it compared to the other full ones. I mean, he's closer than any of the other ones that you might encounter. Though, as I said, there are a few things that are a problem. And all those who, and so this is addressed to the knowers of righteousness who worry about the works of God. And it is against the ones who insult or blaspheme God. And they rebelled when they forsook him. And therefore God hid his face from them. Already we're beginning to see this as a very pro-Torah book. Because it isn't just going to be rebelling on anything, it's going to be backsliding from the law that the rebelling comes in. So it's a totally opposite of Paul in almost every sense. No allegorical exegesis. That is, no symbolic interpretation of passages. And here's a very important concept. He hid his face from Israel and from his temple. Does the book care about the temple? Yes, it's temple-oriented. And delivered them up to the sword. I put it in italics, but I think it's an important concept I want you to pay particular attention to. Do judgment, I think, is important. Delivering up to the sword, I think is important. Particularly because in the New Testament, he uses the word delivering up quite frequently. But actually, it always relates to Judas Iscariot. They didn't. If you look at the Greek in the New Testament, it doesn't literally say who betrayed him. It says who delivered him up in the Greek. The reason I'm interested is to show the parallels in the Christian New Testament documents with the Dead Sea Scroll usages, even though they're being used differently in a different context, I do believe, and that's my theory, and not theory, that's what I've come to observe and feel, that authors, some of the authors, Paul for instance, of documents in the New Testament know concepts in the Dead Sea Scrolls which they are revising, reframing, recasting, deliberately perhaps changing, if you want to be the most unsympathetic in terms of how you put it. So therefore I'm going to watch where it says delivered them up. Usually it's delivered them up to the sword. But because of his memory of the covenant of the first, it says Rishonim the first. What does Burmesh have there?
Forefathers.
Forefathers, that's right. The first are the forefathers. But the reason I put the first in there, because it literally says the first, because of the New Testament, and the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. To show that these concepts are here, but they have a different connotation. And it may not come through, so yes, this literally does mean the forefathers, but it doesn't say forefathers. It doesn't say, Av in Hebrew, Avot. It doesn't say father, fathers. It says the first. So, when I'm a translator, even though, maybe you want to make a beautiful translation, I might put in parentheses or a footnote, literally, this is the first, or I might put the first, and I might then say this means the forefathers, or the ancestors. But also, it's important to put the first. Why? Because of the first covenant as opposed to the new covenant, or the last covenant. And the first as opposed to the last days, the last generation is going to be talked about here. The last times is going to be talked about here. See, that's why it's really important not to lose these words. I don't know if I'm making any sense to you. Now, if you hadn't read it over about 20 times, as I have, and probably 50, you wouldn't pick this up the first 5 readings.
And by first covenant, that's a reference to the Abrahamic covenant?
No, the Mosaic covenant. He left a remnant. Now this can be, a kind of grace here. Paul and Christianity, as we know it, through Paul's view of Christianity. I don't know if Jesus taught grace. I never saw him mention the word in any speech, and I'm not sure what he taught, as I've made clear. But we know what Paul taught because we have his letters. And he speaks about grace and so on. This is a kind of grace, and we'll see it through here quite often. It's not for your sake that he's doing this. It's not because you've necessarily even done good works. It's not because of your righteousness even, perhaps, although that would be good if you were righteous. It's because of his memory of the first. It's a kind of grace up towards the first that he's going to save you, in spite of the way you are. So though it doesn't actually, I don't think there is a word for grace in Hebrew, you see. But even though there is no word for grace as such, it is a kind of grace concept, and we'll see it later in this document too. But it's always connected to the affection for the first. He's going to save you out of love for the first. And this is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, so on and so forth. The forefathers, if you like. What does he do? He left a remnant. That's a concept from Ezekiel, if you know the prophet Ezekiel, which he says a remnant will survive. This is at the time of the destruction. And I did review the whole history of the Israelite Jewish people at the beginning of this class with you folks, as you recall. At the time of the destruction of the first temple, which was around the time of the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, 585. And it's going to be mentioned here, Nebuchadnezzar, you see, in a moment. So Ezekiel was writing around that time, and he says, you know, well, I cut my hair, part of my hair, I burned, part, you know, some will be burned, some will be this, and but a remnant shall survive. I marked out a remnant and said, how many have ever read the prophet Ezekiel and know those passages? You do, huh? You remember something. Well, my young friend here, my young lady friend here, you see only 2 people in the class have ever read Ezekiel and know anything about it. So you're not alone in any way in your feeling of this being new alien stuff. No one in the class is familiar with this kind of material, so it isn't just yourself. I mean, we don't expect people to be familiar with it. It's nice if you do know something about it, but it doesn't. It's not going to help you to actually write about this material. Anyhow, I'm just pointing it out to you that there is an idea of the remnant. Anyway, these people are aware of documents like that, and they honor them. And did not deliver them up, again repeated a second or even a third time. We'll see the word will be used around 6 or 7 times in this book, which is why I italicize it. To be destroyed. So we know delivering up has to do with the sword, destroyed. You see, Judas Iscariot delivered up Jesus according to the New Testament presentation for him to be destroyed, if you will. That's the implication. So we call that betrayed. That's not what the Greek says. And in the era of wrath, well, the era of wrath is first mentioned, if you recall, and we did read that book in this class, in Daniel. And I think Daniel speaks about 7 times 70 years. I'm not sure, but for some reason I think they thought it was either 70 years or 490 years. I'm not sure what the period Daniel. It's difficult to follow the chronology of Daniel, but the wrath is in Daniel. That's there. Now here's a problem in all scroll studies. 390 years after he delivered them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now that's an historical personage. He's named outright. The documents are willing to name, as I think I've said in my work, people in the past who are not a problem for them. They're only to start a mysterious code vis-a-vis present-day people that they could get into some difficulty talking about. The way I do in this class sometimes. I avoid naming people or talk about them just by allusions. And if you want to stay out of legal problems, you're wise to do that. I think it was just the other day I was hearing, I can't remember, but one of the people was talking about, I can't remember, someone in the administration who said or didn't say something or other, and they just used implication. They didn't say who it was. Anyway, he visited them. 390 years is important, because if you feel that this is accurate dating, and that's what I think threw a lot of people off, then we know when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple around 585 or 586 BC. So if you want to knock that down 390 years after that, you get down to about 200 or 180 or 90 BC. So then, of course, the simple-minded people, the people who take this in its overt sense, immediately say, oh, that's when we're talking about. But they don't realize these people did not have an accurate knowledge of chronology. They really didn't know exactly how many years there were between Nebuchadnezzar and the present. And if you look at Josephus, he doesn't have he doesn't have an accurate chronology. If you look at the Talmud, there is no accurate chronology there. So this is either to be taken as accurate, or it's just an attempt to estimate within the Daniel framework of 490 7 times 70 or something like that. 7 weeks of 70. I don't know where they. I think there's also something of the period of time that elapsed between Abraham and I forget that there are two time frames. I think it's 430 years in the Old Testament between Moses and the temple, and then the temple to Nebuchadnezzar. I forget what it is, but I remember 430 is very important in the Old Testament for various reasons. It could be that time frame that they're using. Or, I think, if you've read Ezekiel, they're actually referring to, Ezekiel says in the same time about his prophecy and that he hears about the destruction of the temple. And then he says, and his tongue clung to the roof of his mouth, and he couldn't speak after he got the word of the destruction of the temple. He was among the refugees, he says, at the river Habar in Iraq. And he says his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth for 390 days. Meaning it didn't literally stick. He couldn't prophesy for 390 days. And then the word of God came to him, and he was able to, speak again, as a visionary, prophetical person. I think that's what the 390 years refers to. 300, because it's already mentioned, it's already, alluded to Ezekiel. And it's the 390, not days, but the number 390, I think, is taken from that. The period of time that prophecy was dead in Israel. The period of time Ezekiel couldn't prophesy. I don't think that they know exactly. Anyway, the number was useful. Maybe they thought it was 390, but I don't think that's what they're talking about, precise 390 years. And you say, well, you may be wrong. I may be wrong, but I think that other indicators will show probably that that's true. But this is a very important argument in Dead Sea Scroll studies. What does the 390 years mean? And are they accurate in their chronology? I can only point to Josephus's priest list at the end of the Antiquities. He is totally off. His chronology is totally off. And he's someone who's very smart and lives at this time. And the Talmud, the chronology is totally off. So that these people should have an accurate chronology and everyone else should not, to my mind, is not convincing. They got the 390 years from some other symbolic calculation. But that's something to consider. He visited them. He visited them. A visitation. And he caused a root of planting to grow from Israel and Aaron. Now that is a singular root. And again we have, or the first time anyway, the allusion to Israel and Aaron. And that's a messianic allusion. Because planting imagery is very important in messianic imagery in various psalms and prophetical books that people look for this stuff in. And of course the root is really a word that is used to refer to the Messiah, actually. Let me see if I can find the actual Hebrew here of the root here. What line is that? What, 7? He visited them, and Yismach, Zemach, the Tzemach David, the branch of David, is a very famous, and it's in the scrolls too, messianic idea. And here, this is the verb based on Zemach, the causing to grow, but in fact it's making a branch grow from Israel and Aaron, and a root and so on of planting to inherit the earth. Yeah. What? Yeah, well, what I'm trying to talk about, no, the point of the matter is that, I was going to get to that, but I don't know what's in 168 exactly, but there may be a reference there in 168 to God visiting Mary or something. The point is that this is like the New Testament presentation of Jesus in a way. The Christian presentation is that God visits Mary through the Holy Spirit or whatever, and a child is conceived. You can look up 168 and see if that has that idea in it. I don't remember if it does or not. Who's got a New Testament? What is in? Since you brought it up, you got to. Anyway, I'm sure what we're talking about, that there may have been the usage of that word visit there.
I always thought that, like, visit was a pretty flexible usage, though. Like,
Yeah,
to
but
visit them with destruction, visit them with blessing.
Yeah, it is, but the point of the matter is that we have an idea in Christianity of it's not the same, obviously, but we have an idea of God visiting the earth here and causing something to grow. What's in Luke 1:16? Do you have it?
Yeah, it's,
What's it say?
blessed is the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people.
Okay, that's it. Good. So, and that has to do with the birth of Christ too, doesn't it? That section. I'll write it in here. Now, the point I have a parenthesis that the usage is singular here, even though it's a double reference to Israel and from Aaron. The verbs are all singular. Everything is singular. He calls a root to plant to grow from and to inherit his land and to all that is none of those usages are plural usages. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that's parallel to the New Testament totally, but there is a kind of parallelism there. Now, this may be a whole community and not necessarily a given individual. Later on, it will be an individual in this gospel. The Messiah of Aaron and Israel will be spoken of. This may be a community based on two, priestly and Israelite and so on, but it's still talked about in terms of God visiting the earth. Yes, there is a flexible meaning to visit. Later on, he visits them for destruction, and there's different usages of the word. But here, it's a visit, but not for destruction. It's a visit to engender something, using messianic imagery of the roots of planting. You know, it's funny. In my other work, I hate to give away stuff that I'm going to be publishing, but I can tell you in my other work, which I'm going to be publishing, if my publisher Christine is helping me a bit, and it's a pretty ponderous thing. If my publisher doesn't throw me out the door, there is some stuff in Matthew. I think it's Matthew when they're talking about blind guides. Every plant that my Father has not planted shall be uprooted. Using the planting, the rooting, and other vocabulary that one has here. And in my analysis of that passage, don't you tell anyone that, Christine, that's private. That's not to be communicated. I haven't published it yet. In the work that I'm going to publish, good luck. I'm not sure when my publisher reads it if he's going to pull out his hair and kill me. But Christine's helping me. I sent her some stuff today. I do analyze that very extensively, that every plant that my Heavenly Father has not planted. This is all about a Heavenly Father planting a plant and a root of planting. And those two are operating in the same vocabulary structure, whatever you want to say. And one is against the other, of course. Because it's talking about the blind guides, the Pharisee, they will fall into the pit. How many are familiar with that New Testament passage about the blind guides, the Pharisees falling into the pit, and so on? And then it's also talking about cleaning, not having to clean your hands before you eat. That's what that passage is talking about. And that you shouldn't listen to the Pharisees who want you to wash your hands before you eat. And that he said these things in the parallel thing in Mark, but Mark doesn't have the thing about the plant being uprooted. But in Mark it says declaring all foods clean. Whereas here we do have restrictions on dietary regulations. And in Jamesian Christianity, we definitely have restrictions on dietary regulations. And the whole problem between Paul and James in Galatians is keeping table fellowship with the so-called Gentiles. Gentiles in Greek is ethnon, ethnic peoples. That's what it means, the peoples. We're going to get the same usage here in the scrolls about the peoples. And the whole issue in Galatians 2 between Paul and James there is about table fellowship, and Paul complains bitterly and says, some from James came down. And before they came, Peter was in the habit of eating with non-Jews, Gentiles, peoples, as he calls it, eating with the peoples. But when those of the circumcision or those insisting on circumcision came down, he withdrew. And then it says Barnabas joined him, and then Paul has the effrontery to say, in this hypocrisy. And he calls Peter and Barnabas hypocrites, which shows that we have very deep divisions in the early church, but the whole thing has to do with table fellowship and forbidden foods. And that's what the whole passage about Jesus that I'm talking about with the plan being uprooted and everything has to do with the same question. So all these things are interrelated, but I've just discovered this relationship to that passage recently in my writing of this stuff that I've given you. To inherit the land and prosper on the good things of his earth. And they understood their sinfulness and knew that they were sinners or guilty men. Well, that's one way of putting it in Hebrew. I know another way of putting it. And they confess their sins, or if you prefer, in the New Testament language. And John taught remission of sins in the wilderness. And John taught remission of sins in the wilderness. Depending on how you translate this. And they understood their sinfulness. And they knew that they were sinners, or they knew they were guilty men. Ramesh may be a more literary, more pleasant translation than mine. What's he saying?
They received their iniquity and recognized they were guilty.
But, it can be, Hebrew is a very imprecise language. But in any case, there's an idea of atonement for sin here. So we're not going to get a messianic idea. See, these are things that are not appreciated about how incredible this document is. It's very recondite. It's very hard to get it, as this young lady was telling me. This document is very hard to penetrate. But once you start to penetrate it, you can really penetrate. Now you see why you need a book, because the book, you have to follow it, mark things and so on. Okay, and they were like blind men. Oh, there's the blind man. Oh, I never saw that before. And they were like blind men who fell into a pit. And the blind leading the blind. You see that, Christine? It actually parallels much more. And I'm going to have to rewrite that. See, every time I do the scrolls, I learn something new. I didn't even see that. I saw the pit, and I saw the falling into the pit, but I never saw they were like blind men. Oh my God, blind man in the pit.
Chapter 16.
Oh, it's in lots of places, but I mean, yeah, it's in chapter 16, yeah. I'll correct it on the proofs. Yeah, you've been looking at this stuff, huh? And groping for the way. The way, Acts tells us, was a name for early Christianity in Palestine. Acts tells us at one point, I've got a footnote about it here, Acts tells us at one point that Felix knew a lot about the way. And it means by the way, early Christianity in Palestine. It uses it about 3 different times, Acts does. You can look it up in a concordance. But even more than that, the way relates to the way in the wilderness. John came in the way in the wilderness. How is that put? In any case, I forget. Make my pathway straight. Anyway, in Hebrew here and in the passage about the way in the wilderness, it's the same word, derek, way. And the way terminology is very strong in all the documents of the scroll. So you see, we're getting parallel after parallel after parallel with the New Testament, even though the connotation and meaning is different. We just did one page here. And what people couldn't see, I think, originally is that the vocabulary was so alien and the ideas so different that they couldn't see the relationship. But there's nothing in the 2nd century BC that looks anything like this. That's why we read the Maccabee books. That's why we read all that material, because we want to know what the 2nd century BC looked like. And the first time we hear stuff like this is in the New Testament, although it's different in the New Testament, I admit, but now we're seeing more and more vocabulary, and we'll see so much vocabulary that's the same, it'll just, but it's different connotation, because it's works righteousness against Pauline faith ideology. Anyway, they groped for the way for 20 years. So now that's a precise thing. They were lost for 20 years. They didn't have a leader. So something happened. Maybe the Messiah was killed. Something happened in between God visiting them and then 20 years. This is all very esoteric. But something is going on here. And God, listen to that, considered their works because they sought him with a whole heart. God considered their works. And keeping that consistent translation of works and heart. Paul is very big on the heart. Symbolism, the scrolls are very big on the heart. Whole heart, pure heart, and so on. Let's see. And God observed their deeds, says Vermesh. Well, you can't change it. Because if God considered all you who know righteousness and consider the works of God, you can't suddenly change it to deeds. Because it's the same word in Hebrew in both instances.
Why is states he keeps with deeds the whole way?
Because he's a jerk. that guy. Don't even tell me about that translation. Pardon me. I worked with that guy. Okay, it's just they're not even aware of these issues. It doesn't matter what they're. Well, I don't know why they do it. The word is, well, sure you could say deeds. Why don't we say deeds of God in the beginning then?
No, I mean he keeps it.
Yeah.
Deeds
Oh, well,
the
he
way
keeps
through.
deeds all the time because that's his brain mindset. I mean, it's ma'asim. It's based on the root doing. So, doing. You want to use deeds, go. But works is what we're used to, you see. Works is the theological thing we're familiar with. That's what they're talking. I mean, these are works. These are righteous works. They're not just deeds. It's not just someone giving me a tip in the in North Beach, San Francisco. I'm not giving someone a handout or something. These are works. Righteous works of the law, works of the Torah. And you see what you say why. I don't know why I asked that. And if you don't use works, then you're not being square with the public who knows about works. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay. Primarily those are very fundamentalist Christians who did that translation. Okay, so they particularly don't want to use the word works. Might mean too much. And God, I'll stick to mine here, considered their works because they sought him for their whole heart, and because their works were righteous, you see, and they had also confessed their sins, remission of sins, they raised up for them a teacher of righteousness. Because righteousness is important. We've heard that at the beginning. This is addressed to who? All those who what? Know righteousness, the knowers of righteousness. Those people who care about righteousness. And to guide them. The blind guides again in the New Testament for making people fall into, leading the blind into a pit. To guide them in the way of his heart. By the way, in all that's what I mean about being consistent. In the Habakkuk commentary on this and all of them, we're going to hear that the righteous teacher knows the way of God's heart. And God put the knowledge into his heart, the teacher of righteousness' heart. or the righteous teacher, whichever you prefer. It can be teacher of righteousness, it can be righteous teacher. It's more on tzedek. More is teacher, tzedek is righteousness. So it can be teacher of righteousness or righteous teacher. Either one is fine. To guide them in the way of his heart, and he made known, here's why we want to use the first, to the last generations, what he would do in the last generation. So we're in the last times. So important to the New Testament again. You know, I mean, just reading this, it's hard to put this in the 2nd century BC, which is where the consensus scholars have wanted to put it, on the basis of paleography. Nothing else. I say that paleography is an imprecise science at best, and it's internal data where there's a question that has to take precedence over external data, such as so-called paleographical sequences. I criticize all that in the Maccabees Zadokites book. I have a whole chapter on paleography. If you are looking at that, you should be reading that. The rest of that book by now. And he made known to the last generation what he would do in the last generation to the congregation. Now that can be a congregation. A can be, it actually literally means assembly. And of course, assembly in Christianity means church. So if you want to be, highfalutin, you can call it congregation. If you want to be sensationalist, you can call it church. Assembly is what it means. Anyway, the assembly or church or congregation of traders. Now, this is traders. And what do the traders do? They weren't just people of a different party. They turned aside from the way. They were turners aside from the way. Now, we know the way is by now. The way in the wilderness. We're going to find out it's the way of perfection. Yeah.
I'm not looking at your translation, but did you capitalize the way? Like,
I always capitalize important terms just to call people's attention to it. I capitalize everything that's important, like righteousness I capitalize. I just want people to pay attention. You know, if you put everything in small things, then, I like to capitalize important concepts, ideas. But, there's no capitals or small letters here. Hebrew doesn't have such a thing. I do that for the benefit of the reader. Yeah, I capitalize turners aside from the way because I want people to look at it. What do you have in the Burmese language?
It's lowercase.
No, forget the capital. What's the translation? I know, everything's lowercase. He's not interested.
Congregation of traders.
He doesn't care about important concepts, and that's fine. I mean, his is more fun. Congregation of traders, and who are what? What about the way?
To those who departed from the way.
Who departed from the way. Yeah, but the actual Hebrew, again, is literally a noun. Turners aside, depart from is, it's not a verb. It was a noun. The people who turn aside, the turners aside. Anyway, I'm just trying to be precise. Either one is good, but the literal Hebrew is turner aside from. This is the time it is written, like a straying heifer did Israel stray. And it's a quote from Hosea the prophet. Now another individual is finally introduced, a man of scoffing. A man of jesting. It's usually called the scoffer. But I don't think that's good enough. I mean, a man of jesting. In fact, it can also mean the comedian, the joker. Not the Joker in the sense of Batman, but the man whose ideas are a joke. The ideological adversary whose ideas are just a joke. It's not serious. It's like Bin Laden would talk about his opponents. He wouldn't call him a scoff. His opponent's a man of scoffing. That's very... Does Vermesh have scoffer or man of scoffing? Huh? Scoffer. Yeah, but it literally says man of scoffing. It's two words. Ish halatzon. So you see, it can be, So a man of scoffing is like, very, very clumsy, but jesting, comedian, I put in parentheses. Anyway, he arose. And what did the man of scoffing, or the scoffer, or the jester, or the joker do? Anyway, he's a person who's not to be taken seriously, right?
Yeah.
He's not serious. This is not a serious person. And he's an opponent, right? And he's an ideological opponent. He's not a political opponent necessarily, because what he does is an ideological thing. He's part of the congregation of traitors to the way in the wilderness. They were originally part of the way in the wilderness, but they turned aside and deserted the way in the wilderness. This is going to be consistent throughout. See, now this is really packed with stuff. I don't mean to be a braggart or anything, but only someone who's read it a lot of times and is familiar with it can really begin to open it up. Maybe someone else can do it better, but in lieu of doing it better than me, so I'm doing it for you. But you can see how if you read this one time, you'd go to the scholars and say, "Oh, well, what are the scholars saying?" And you just say, "Oh, well, these are the Essenes, and they're unknown teachers, and it's back to 2nd century BC, and that's it." And you wouldn't be reading this. You would say, "Oh, that's an interesting document," but I believe that everyone will read it, and I think the public should read it carefully who cares about religion, and that's why I do it in great detail in this class with you, which is why I don't make you work like 100 different things. I just want you to know stuff that's written here well. Stuff in Josephus well, and stuff here. It doesn't matter to me what all this other literature really writes about, which can be useful, it may not be. But this is where the struggle is, right here in the text. So let's look at it again. I want to hurry, so I want to finish before 1:15. What did he do? He pours over Israel the waters of lying. Later on, we're going to get a guy called the spouter of lying. But you have to understand, the word spouter in Hebrew is the same root as the word pouring out is in the verb. The verb pouring is the same root as the noun spouter. Do you follow me? Hebrew is built up on 3-letter roots. One is matif hakazav, and this is hittif. Hittif is the verb, matif is the noun. So really, it's not really the spouter, it's the pour out of lying. He's called the matif hakazav. Kazav is lying, the pour out of lying elsewhere. So this is the same person. This scoffer, jester, joker is the same person as is elsewhere called in the scrolls, and that's the consistency of these documents, the liar, the man of lying, the pour out of lying, the spouter of lying. And so what, then there's also an idea of waters. Could even imply baptismal waters. In any case, he's poured out lying waters over Israel. And he's a liar. And he's not to be taken seriously. And he's an ideological adversary. And they hate him. And they don't like him. And they have a great deal of anger against him. And he's the ideological adversary of the righteous teacher. We just get one thing, I'll get a question. What does he do? He brings low the everlasting heights. He abolished the pathways of righteousness. He removed the boundary markers, and here we're back again, which the forefathers, had marked out for their inheritance. And it's for this reason that God, or he, called down upon them the curses of his covenant and delivered them up to the avenging sword of vengeance of the covenant. This is not a very peaceful text. This liar, scoffing, jesting person, what did he do wrong? Well, the pathways of righteousness and the boundary markers that the first laid out are the law. That's what the Mosaic law. And what he did was remove the boundary markers of the Mosaic law, which tells you what righteousness is. And it's for this reason that God became angry, because this is what the ancestors, the first generations had marked out for their inheritance. And therefore he delivered us up at this time to the sword, the avenging sword of the covenant. What's your question?
Is this figure a historical person, or
we'll
is
see.
it constructed for the sake
I think he's a historian. He goes through lots of documents.
Paul?
Well, that's my theory, but it doesn't mean that I'm right. I've tried to explain to you, yeah, in my book I think it's a Paul. It's a Paul-like person, whether it's Paul or not will depend on the chronology. That would make James the righteous teacher and Paul the ideological liar. Yeah, but these people are there, and James is the tzaddik in early Christianity, the righteous one. In fact, they use it in place of his own name. And since you're asking me, I'm not saying that is Paul, but I mean the point of the matter is it's a Paul-like teacher in the sense that he teaches straying from the law. He deserted the new covenant. He went astray and led others astray. And what he did is he led them astray in a trackless waste. Where is that? Caused them to wander astray, line 15, in a trackless waste with no way, no derek, no way in the wilderness, no John the Baptist-like way. We're going to get the way in the community rule with baptism and everything else. We're also going to get the way in the wilderness twice spoken of in the community rule. Well, you can't have things like the way in the wilderness twice mentioned in the community rule with the same ideology as here, and then tell me we're in the 2nd century BC. This is what I mean on ideological grounds. You're in a 1st century environment, because we didn't see anything like this in the Maccabee books, in Josephus, or anything else. The only place you see this kind of a church is in the New Testament, but from an opposite ideological perspective, from the perspective of removing the boundaries. You see? So, and I'm not saying that one's right, the other's wrong. I'm just saying this is the native Palestinian. So when people say, oh, Eisenman said these are Christian documents. No, I'm not saying that at all. Because Christianity is what Paul preached and what was accepted, because Paul is the first person, I think, who spoke about Christ in written form. And Luke in Acts tells us Christians were first called Christians at Antioch in Syria in a Pauline community. And that's where Christians were first. So whatever these people are in Palestine, talk about them. So we speak about Christians, but they're not Christians in the normative sense of Christian. So anyone who says, like, Ramesh never reads my stuff and criticizes me, he knows nothing about my work, he just doesn't even read it, and then he says I say that the liar and the wicked priest are the same person. He says that in one of his introductions, which is total nonsense. All my work, I say they're two different people. The liar is an ideological adversary, and the wicked priest is the person responsible for the death of the righteous teacher. But, so these people, they don't read your works, they just criticize you, they think you're saying something. Obviously, you just superficially say, oh, this isn't Christianity. And of course it isn't Christianity. But I say it's proto-Christianity. It's what Christianity was in Palestine before it went overseas. Before it got colonized, you follow me? It's Christianity before, it's Essenism as Christianity was in Palestine before it became Christian as we call Christianity. It's hard to understand that, and you have to have a knowledge of the documents. Let's just finish this up, because we have to go soon. We'll come back to this next time. For they sought smooth things and chose illusions. Now, the seekers after smooth things is another common expression that goes across all the documents, which is why I say these are consistent documents. This is not just any old collection. This is a collection of documents of illusion. And the smooth things in Hebrew is halakot. And if you know these Semitic languages, they like to play on words. So halakot actually plays on another Hebrew that Rabbinic Judaism is very interested in. Halachot. This is legal traditions that you find in the Talmud. And that's what Phariseeism did. So halachot. The name for the law, the Talmud, and the Mosaic law together is the halakha. So most of us think this is an aspersion against the Pharisees, and the halachot that they sought. But Paul calls himself a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He says he learned at the feet of Pharisees. So he's not to be separated from whoever's being criticized here. The Pharisees are definitely being criticized, I think. And what's wrong with the Pharisees? They seek smooth things and chose illusions and watch out for breaks or loopholes, an expression from Isaiah 30. And they chose the fair neck. And I'd say that means they chose the easy way. In other words, they chose the fairest of the flock. They chose the easy way. They didn't do the hard way. You know, they didn't follow purity regulations and so on and so forth.
They allowed outside.
Huh?
They allowed outside visitors.
I'll get to that. You know, I think these are the, well, anyway, let's just hold on a minute, and let's finish here. And they justify the wicked and condemn the righteous. Now that's where you really should use the word condemn, because it really is the opposite of justify. And here we actually do have the word justification. What do these people do? They justify the evil ones, but they condemn, make evil. It's the word in Hebrew is make evil. It's not the way that first condemn was that you had. That was do judgment. This is different. This is actually to condemn, to make evil. In the same way justify is to make righteous. So they called the evil people righteous and the righteous people evil. They made the righteous wicked and they made the wicked righteous. They justified the wicked or the evil people. Now in the New Testament, if you recall, Jesus says one sinner is worth 99 righteous ones in the wilderness. And they're always interested in going after one sinner, one person, one stray lamb, and so on and so forth. Again, it's the total opposite perspective of here. These people believe that the righteous are the righteous, and the sinners or the wicked are the wicked. And later on, in column 4, we're going to hear that the sons of Zadok, they do it right. They justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. Now, when Jesus is spoken of in the terms of Isaiah 53, in the suffering servant, if you look at that passage, you'll know that the passage is, and Jesus justified the righteous. That's the same thing that we're getting here. So we actually have a notion of justification theology developing here. It's primitive. It's Palestinian. And they transgressed the Brill covenant, broke the law. Let me finish up. They banded together against the soul of the righteous one and against all the walkers in perfection. That's what this group calls itself here and in other documents. And they pursued them with the sword and attempted to divide the people, and the wrath of God. Anyway, it goes on like that. This is a history of a certain period. These people call themselves lots of things. Among those things is walker in perfection, or perfection of the way. They are the perfect ones. Now, I can pick this up in terms of New Testament ideology. Next time, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect in the Sermon on the Mount. Unless your righteousness exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall in no way enter the kingdom of heaven. Lots of things that link up here, but I don't have the breath, time, and energy to do it right now, so we'll stop it there. Your question we'll get next time, too, about the big things, what they saw smooth things of, which I think are the big overarching things of foreign appointment of high priests, foreign rule, sacrifices in the temple on behalf of foreigners, big things, divorce, niece marriage, not little things. That's what they differ on.
I mean, that's what makes their way easier.
Huh?
That's what makes their way easier.
Yeah, that's what makes it really easy. But also the Pauline, see, I think these are both